Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Upskill with Reed Tech, SPL Basics and Beyond. So I will be your moderator today. My name is Erin McDermott, and I am the Pharma Marketing Manager here at Reed Tech. And your main presenter today is going to be Gary Sainer, our Senior Manager of Information Solutions and our resident SPL guru. Gary is also the current chair of the Reed Tech, of the industry SPL process team. So we're really lucky to have him presenting this information today. So just a couple quick logistics. Hopefully everyone is familiar with this platform, but if you do have any questions during the presentation, you can drop them into the chat box and we'll get to them at the tail end of the presentation if possible. And if not, we'll have somebody from Reed Tech follow up with you directly. And then I also just wanted to quickly point out our resource center here on our Reed Tech website. You can follow the directions on the screen, the Navigation Resources Knowledge Center, and find some of our blog posts and past webinars for other topics you might be interested in. And definitely make sure you're following us on LinkedIn and Twitter for the most recent industry updates. Okay, so for today's presentation, Gary is, covering all the SPL basics as we advertised. So US FDA regulatory framework and drug requirements, SPL basics, SPL drug registration and listing, SPL implementations, and then we will have a live Q&A session. We also did want to let you know that this is the first in a new series of webinars, Upskill with Reed Tech, where we hope to really kind of get back to basics and answer some, really specific but basic industry questions on SPL and some other things that we specialize in. So more to come on that later. So with that, I will hand the presentation off to Gary. And thanks for joining us today, Gary.
Yeah, glad to be here, Erin, and thank you for that introduction. As we were preparing, as you know, there was a lot of material that we had to cut off. As they say, it ended up on the, the cutting room floor. But I'm looking forward to going into some future events and pulling that information up and doing a little bit deeper dive into some of the topics we touch on today, and also bringing up some new ones. But today's going to be a pretty high-level review of the SPL niche inside the pharma world, and focusing on some of the regulatory requirements that we're going to start off with here, just to lay the background. And those that have been in the industry for a number of years, you're probably well aware of this. But just bear with us, and we do know that there's a number of those in the audience that are brand new to the industry. So we're going to lay out a lot of basic background information before we get into some of the details of SPL. All right, starting at the executive branch. From the president on down, there's a cabinet, and the Department of Health and Human Services has a chair on that cabinet. They attend that. They have a lot of information, a lot of areas of expertise, one of which is the Food and Drug Administration. And again, FDA is a very broad organization. There are a lot of departments and offices and so on, but we're going to talk about the particular centers that are inside the FDA, and there's 6 of those. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, Center for Veterinary Medicine, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and Center of Tobacco Products. Pretty big mouthful. Today we're going to concentrate on just the first 3. CDER, CBER, and CVM have adopted SPL as this particular vehicle to collect information about the products that they need to administer. Now, actually, CDRH uses SPL for a little bit different purpose. They use it for collecting something called unique device identification, but we won't be referring to that today. Just a comment there, just to be comprehensive when we talk about SPL. So we need to understand the legal framework for device registration and product listing. And with that, we just need to do a quick refresher on how these things come about, starting with the law. So between the Senate and House of Representatives, they work on a law, they pass it, the president signs it. And that information then is put into the Code of Federal Regulations. So many times it's not word for word. It's a little bit different. Sometimes it's not always 100% migrated in the Code of Federal Regulations, but you will see something called a proposed rule, and that's published in the Federal Register. So this is a public, basically a public newspaper of things going on. And if I remember, it comes out every day. There's a lot of activity. Every once in a while, you see something in there about the FDA. But if you hunt and peck, you'll certainly be able to find these proposed rules. So this is the first step of a three-step process: publishing the proposed rule, opening up the comment period, and that can vary 30 to 180 days, and sometimes it's different than that. And then the third step is after the FDA receives all those comments back, they will digest that information, evaluate it, and then it kind of goes into a black hole as far as time goes. There might be a very quick final rule that's coming out as a result of that, if it's very urgent matter, but it might sit there for months, even years, and then we see a final rule, and that goes into the Code of Federal Regulations. I do highly recommend following that electronic Code of Federal Regulations link. Always use the electronic version. That's the one that's dynamic. It gets refreshed. If you hunt around the internet and don't go to the electronic Code of Federal Regulations, you can find some old versions and stale information. When you go to the regulation, you'll find that it's very concise and relatively short, and it probably won't give you enough detail to actually act on that particular topic. There's a third layer to this. We have the law, the regulation, and the third layer is guidance. So the guidance documents are authored by FDA for our discussion. And again, they go through that three-step process: the draft guidance, the comment period, and then a final guidance. And again, after the comment period, there might be months, years before the final guidance comes out. These particular guidances are not only published in the Federal Register, but they also go to the FDA guidance document database. Now, there's one thing unique about a guidance. You'll see in the preamble that this particular document reflects the FDA's current thinking on the matter, or it's not binding, and it's basically something that is guide you, but it doesn't have the legal framework behind it. So that is interesting. There's alternatives that can be suggested. For the most part, I think all of industry follows guidances, and alternatives I think are relatively rare. There is one exception to this general rule about voluntarily observing a guidance. Back in 2012, FDASIA, this FDA Safety and Innovation Act, gave FDA the authority to require compliance to a guidance if it related to electronic signature, electronic submissions, and they gave the power and authority to FDA to roll out a final guidance and then require 2 years later for industry to conform to that electronic submission guidance. So that's the one exception. The FDA does actually pull that off the shelf and use that power every once in a while. They actually did use it for the REMS initiative in converting over to electronic submissions using SPL. So it was the final document came out in 2020, and the end of 2022, December, it's now in place and has to be observed. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. When you get to this particular level, you have to go find some information. So if we were to try to follow this pathway and look up information about drug establishment, registration, and listing, for example. This is a screenshot of the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations website. And you can do a search, free text search, and work your way through the search results. The other ways to do browsing, I found that subchapter C inside Title 21 was relevant to this particular search. Now remember, there's about 50 or so titles. These are basically broad discussions in the Code of Federal Regulations. Title 21 has to do with food and drug. So you obviously want to focus in there right away. It cuts down a lot of the searching. But if we were to open up subchapter C, drugs in general, we would get some more subtopics. In this particular case, a number of parts. And down at the bottom, part 207 has to do with registration and listing of drugs. So that's great. So if you open up that, guess what? There's a whole nother list of subparts and good information about registration, National Drug Code, listing, and to our particular interest, registration and listing. So this 207.61 has to do with that. If you open that up, you'll see a relatively short little paragraph on this topic. And basically, we learned from this that the FDA will be using or require electronic format and require the use of the electronic drug registration listing system. Submissions need to be in a form that they can process, review, and archive, and they may periodically issue guidance on how to provide the registration and listing information in electronic format. Now, you can read that and say, well, I still don't have enough information. You know, that's great from the regulation, but I don't know if that's a text file that I'm supposed to submit. Is that a Word document? Is that a Excel spreadsheet? Is it a PDF? Or is it, you know, something else? Who knows? Maybe an XML. So in this particular case, the content in the regulation is not enough for you to act on. There needs to be additional reference. In this particular mention, they talk about guidance. So if we go over to that guidance database that we referred to earlier, enter drug establishment registration and drug listing. Lo and behold, here's this document. Many times it's not so clean, but in this case, one document came up, and you open that, and oh, sure enough, here's some information that talks about the submission in electronic format. And you read through this, it's relatively short, only about 15, 16 pages, but it does say use SPL, structured product labeling, for submission of drug establishment and drug listing information. Now, one of the takeaways here is to realize that the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations has a lot of good stuff. Part of your reference material, the guidance database is very good. That's not to say that's your only two tools. The FDA has a huge amount of content in website, electronic drug registration listing system. Website has a lot of pages and materials. But there's one other place that is really the motherlode of information when it comes to SPL. So the SPL resources webpage, and this has a lot of good information. It starts off with guidance documents. And look at this, the second bullet down is the very document that we found, you know, searching previously. And this is all in one nice place, everything that has to do with structured product labeling. This should be your go-to webpage when you're trying to find information. It also has implementation guides, and there's a really detailed implementation guide and validation for SPL. 227 pages that, you know, really gets down into the weeds of how the SPL and XML should be created. There's other instructions, schema, style sheet, tools, terminology. You know, there's a lot of really good stuff on that webpage. All right, that's good to know. One of the questions that comes up is, what about the timing? Where does this establishment registration and product listing come into play in the overall scheme of things? So if we take a look at this life cycle and is pretty common, probably familiar with the, the 5 steps, going from discovery all the way through post-marketing distribution and surveillance. There's a stop along the way when, for a new drug application, you'll submit that for FDA review, and it has a lot of information. It could be literally 300, 400,000 pages. A few of those pages have to do with the content of labeling that is packaged in SPL. So this is a draft. You send it in, the FDA negotiates and comes back. You need to make some changes. So this is a touch point for SPL. The second touch point is when that finally becomes negotiated, or after negotiating and becomes final, you do need to list that particular document with the FDA. They make a copy of that available in the National Library of Medicine Daily Med. And then you also need to register your establishment before you launch the product into commercial distribution. So there's 5 real highlighted milestones here. This is certainly not comprehensive, but there's 5 steps along the way. Get that marketing approval in place, pay that user fee. And then steps 3 and 4 have to do with SPL. Register that establishment and list the drug product. Make sure that NDC number and everything's on the packaging conforms to all the labeling requirements. And then you have some good steps taken care of before you actually launch the product. All right, we're going to pivot a little bit and switch our attention. Let's talk about FDA SPL basics. So we're going to focus in now on actual structured product labeling. Back in the 2005 timeframe, it seems like quite a while ago now, the FDA had these goals to increase information management, support electronic health records, make data available in Daily Med, and support the internal reviews. And they came up with this document that we actually looked at a little bit earlier. So for us to understand that, we need to get in a time machine and go back to 2004, 2005 timeframe and look what was happening in the labeling world. There was a long-standing use of paper, and that finally ended in 2004, where after 5-year transition, the PDFs were used and then eventually required in 2004. After that, there was a short period of time where SPL was allowed, and after roughly a year, it was required. So that transition was very quick. Industry scrambled to meet this requirement of 2005. For us to understand structured product labeling, we need to take a little bit of a short primer and take a look at the SPL document itself, and it's XML based. So bear with me here, just a couple slides on XML. XML is not only, well, it's used many places, as you folks probably know, over and above structured product labeling, but it does have the ability to capture headings, paragraphs, text, tables, lists, footnotes, images, everything that we normally would put in like a Word document, for example. There's 2 views that we ought to be aware of. The first view is that there's this raw view, which is machine readable. It's a particular view where editing and authoring and computer readers and parsers and so on would operate on. And this particular view or presentation of XML has information in tagged cells, and there's information that is related with metadata. So if you have Jane Doe and an address, well, you'd have a tag, a structure for first name, middle name, last name, address, town, city, country, and so on. And that information is connected with and captured inside a hierarchy for that particular data value. The other view is what is referred to as the rendered view. So you'll need a browser or some kind of display to look at that. And this is the human readable, so you're actually now able to see it without all those angle brackets in the raw presentation. And what you see is dictated by a style sheet. So if the style sheet says, I'm not going to present the first name, I'm only going to present the last name, Doe, and maybe I'll skip the address and I'll just put city and country, that's what you see as a result of that style sheet. Another style sheet layered on top of the very same data could have the full name and different color fonts and different presentation, and actually put it in a table so it could present it all based on the particular style sheet. The original source content is the same. Two different style sheets give you two different presentations. So what does that mean? If you look at regular narrative that you and I would author in a Word document, we write and then we put bolding and underlining and bullets and so on, all embedded into the particular narrative that we write. XML is different. In this particular case, you can write information and just put it in as content only. There's various ways in which you can do drafts and finals and updates and have collaboration, everything that you would normally do with some XML editors. And in some cases, you can have reusable chunks where it might go into different documents. The FDA was very excited about that because now they could reuse the information in a couple different places. It makes updates and filtering and searching and so much easier. On the industry side, if you make use of those style sheets, you can take the content that would normally go for approval and then compose it for package inserts, or compose it a different way with a different style sheet for advertising or your website, or put it into 8.5 by 11 document, or something smaller for Reader's Digest or for advertising. So all using the very same raw material. So that's the quick little review of XML. When it comes to SPL, this is a particular implementation of the XML document markup standard. And there's an organization referred to as Health Level 7. It's a standards developing organization that built the schema, basically the rules of the road, the tagging, the hierarchy, how it all fits together. And then layered on top of that, the FDA now owns the style sheets, and they also control the implementation guide, that 227 document that I mentioned earlier, all the business rules about how you go about building the document, and they also provide particular vocabularies. So with a particular set of instructions, the FDA is able to support structured product labeling for National Drug Code labeler code request. And in the same fashion, they can create the variations for the establishment registration and the SPL labeling. So this concept allows you to have many different types of documents with one standard. And the FDA just took hold of this and created many different implementations, starting with the content of labeling from labeling. And that we now have labeler code requests, establishment registration, listing. And I won't go through all these, but as of yesterday, they were up to 61 different documents. And then we have the close cousin, not a SPL document, but a comma separated variable document that is used for the listed drugs and biologic products amount report. So there's a lot of different documents that are used for electronic submissions. If we were to lay out a lot of these documents, not all of them, onto a timeline, we see way back early 2005, this SPL original, as I refer to it, was launched. Shortly thereafter, there's this physician labeling rule, which revised the labeling structure, organized it into 7 different sections. And then over the course of time, 2009, I'll highlight the establishment registration drug listing was now mandatory. generic facility self-identification, lot distribution, the bulk or blanket no change listing. And then just recently, I already mentioned this SPL REMS came into force in December of 2022. So we're sitting over here on the right-hand side of this timeline. What's in the future? Well, there was some references to the pharmaceutical quality and the chemistry manufacturing controls that would sit inside a NDA that would perhaps use SPL, capture a lot of information, stability information, and so on. And also, there's something there's an initiative that FDA has been batting around for a number of years now called quality metrics, which is basically a production report of the amount of products that were created and manufactured, what the reject rate was, how many were reused and reworked, how many were scrapped, how many were distributed, that sort of thing. That both of these are not enforced yet, but they have been pretty much taken off the SPL roadmap and put into another standard from HL7 referred to as FHIR, F-H-I-R. So we might have seen the heavy use of SPL from FDA winding down, and the future, I think, is toward this other standard that I mentioned going forward. So we'll see how that fleshes out. It's hard to guess what the FDA does, but that's the inkling and the expectation at this point in time. I would just want to take a second to go back to this physician labeling rule. This is in force for a number of years now, but that is the content that is packaged in a SPL. So you see the first couple sections there, the highlights, the full prescribing information would include the warning, and then the 17 numbered. The couple here at the end do not actually have section numbers, but have numbers just for this presentation. But you have a principal display panel, medication guides, ingredients, and appearances. So this last section is where metadata about the product, referred to as the drug listing, the data elements are captured. And there's a lot of metadata, there's codes, and some of those are listed here. This is just a tip of the iceberg sort of thing. So this is where you'll see some national drug codes being listed, the dosage form, the route of administration, units of measure, presentation, and so on. So there's a lot of terminology that goes into building those data elements. I think we covered a really quick review of basics. There's some things obviously we could go into, but I would like to move on, looking at the time here, to focus our attention on what the SPL drug registration and listing submission requirements are in the timing thereof. When we talk to clients, many times there's this question, well, do I really need to list and we go through a couple questions with them, and these are pretty important. Is the product that you're describing, is it a drug? We won't go into the definition of a drug here today, but many times this is not a black and white answer, actually. Surprisingly, sometimes they're a cosmetic, or maybe it's a food, or maybe it's a medical device. It might be a little bit more complex and have a combination product, might have two regulated products together. So you would think that's an easy yes or no answer, but many times it's not. The other question is whether or not your firm is participating in the manufacturing and the processing of the drug. And then is this drug placed in commercial distribution in the US? So exports, to other non-US territories and areas and so on, would not come into play and have a required FDA SPL. Second question is, what products are candidates for drug listing? And I won't go through the list. There's three that are probably more common than the others. The active pharmaceutical ingredients, the prescription drugs, and over-the-counter. Lots of variations there. that all need to be listed. There are some substances that do not need to be listed. So you're looking at some of these foods and dietary supplements, and then the inactive ingredients as well, are at this point do not need to be listed. They might flow into a drug product later on. I'm talking about the inactive ingredients at this point, but of them themselves, they would not need to have the drug listing being presented for them. Let's get a little bit more into the mechanics of actually doing the registration and listing. How is this actually performed? So starting on the left, if we were followed the information, it would flow from the manufacturer through a gateway, and there's a couple different tools available and methods. We'll touch on that next. And then the data flows into the FDA. They have a number of databases, FDA label, label.fda, drugs at FDA has some other information about labeling. SPL documents are then passed over to the National Library of Medicine and made public on the Daily Med. And there's roughly 140, 150,000 drug products listed on that database, and then that's made to the public. So we're going to dive down into this submission method. There are options out there. So going from left to right, you have the data, you collect it, you need to collect that metadata. You may will certainly have to have the labeling content, the narrative, and you'll need to include images, principal display panel, and if it's appropriate, there's some patient information, medication guides, information for use, and that sort of thing. So collecting all that, I call it data, flowing into this particular next step. And you can make use of internal staff, or you can outsource it. But basically, there's some manual activities there. I highly recommend not trying to generate an SPL using, simple text editor. That is really cumbersome and not extreme efficient at all. But they can make some use of tools with this outsourced model or internal staffing. Now, many companies would make use of a third-party vendor for a tool. They might only develop their internal tool. That's certainly a possibility. Retech actually offers both of these. We have the outsourced model and a tool that you can make a subscription to. Your other options would be some FDA tools. Xforms is available. You can go there and create the content. It would build an SPL. All three of those first ones would need to submit that SPL output through the electronic submission gateway to the FDA. The last option is slightly different, and that is referred to as CEDAR Direct. So again, you can go to this FDA site, make some entries, and it has a direct connection into the database. So SPL kind of happens in the background. You don't have too much visibility about what's going on there. Data then, depending on the type of SPLs you submit, you have some outputs on the right-hand side. Now, this is extremely important when you think about the downstream users. You might think sitting in the manufacturing location all the way here on the left that you're only having one connection, you're sending it to the FDA, and that's the end of the pathway. Not true, not true, not true. There's a huge amount of information that is stored in public databases. We won't go into all of those here, but then there's a huge industry downstream that uses that information. So there's this wave of data processors, there's aggregators out there, there's systems that like electronic health record systems. Actually, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, uses this content as well. So that's really the data processing. The second way, or the next wave there, are the actual drug dispensers and healthcare providers. So this is the physicians, your pharmacies, clinics, and other distributors. And the last wave is the end users. So it finally gets out here. The patient public is able to access this information. Payers, insurance, traceability, registration, and so on, all make use of this data. So values that you submit are migrated to this huge audience downstream. What's the impact of that? Make sure the data is correct, because once erroneous data flows into this field, it's very difficult to make corrections. You know, maybe they don't get updates or whatever. So high quality data reporting is extremely paramount, and keeping it current. So if you have a change to your labeling, maybe you have to add a warning, or you have a new package level, all very important. Aaron, I'm going to take a breath and ask you to do a poll at this point. Can you load that up for us?
Absolutely. Well, you have earned a breath at this point, Gary. Thank you for going through all of that. Definitely a lot of good information there. So for our first poll today, we are going to ask what SPL submission option you are currently using. An in-house option where you built your own software, an in-house option of purchasing software, Read Tech, a different third-party vendor, or the free FDA submission tool. So I'm going to leave this open for maybe about 15 more seconds, and then we can take a look at the answer. Hopefully 100% Read Tech. So let's at least after your presentation, Gary, I'm sure it'll be 100% Read Tech.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And we can go ahead and take a quick look at the results. So, that is good to see. It looks like we have about 74% are using Read Tech. And the next is definitely the free FDA submission tool at 17%. That's interesting.
Okay, very good. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to roll on. And thank you, Aaron, for that poll. I know there's a couple more coming up as well, so keep an eyes open for that. I wanted to touch base on this slide. I know it's pretty busy, but we'll just kind of real quickly work our way left to right. And the information that is presented here would be an annual calendar. So every year you're kind of faced with all these events spread about, you know, January to December, and there are some timelines that are fixed. Some are variable based on anniversaries, but a good portion of these have fixed timelines. Every year you need to do this. So starting on the left, if you're a biologic manufacturer and you'll need to report lot distribution data, and that's occurring usually every 6 months. It depends a little bit on the actual product, but something called the lot distribution -1. I arbitrarily put that in February. It's based on an anniversary. And then 6 months later, you see lot distribution 2 in August. So again, they can flex, but typically there'll be 2 of those on your calendar for the year. The next one that I'll highlight is the drug sample distribution report. So this is a report that must be submitted by April 1 for the previous year. How many samples to distribute, and to what doctors, what hospitals, and so on. In the month of May, there's this self-identification. So this applies to the generic drug facilities. They do need to identify themselves, submit information, and that happens to be in that particular month, the month of May. In June is the first month that the FDA recommends that you do a review of your labeling. Is there anything that needs to be updated? Now, they obviously prefer that if there's a change, that you respond, quickly and make an update. But there's a concerted effort here in the regulations in June, and this is also repeated back in December. So there's a drug listing review, June and December every year. Take a look at what's in your labeling. Is it current? Is it fresh? if necessary, do an update. And then the fourth quarter of the year is very busy. First of all, there's the establishment registration. Every year, you'll need to make a change, like an update to your establishment registration, or submit something called a no change. And this has to be in the fourth quarter time frame. The other requirement that must occur in the fourth quarter is this blanket no change certification. So if you did not have an update to your labeling, in the previous year, you submitted everything and everything was good, no changes, then you're able to simply list that NDC number and indicate to the FDA that everything is unchanged. I want to talk a little bit about what I refer to as the drug amount report. As a result of the CARES Act, this listed drugs need to be reported. They are the FDA has a guidance document. It's proposed at this point in time. There's a part of the law, the act, that actually says you have to do reporting, but then the FDA has not put the exact date. Right now, they have recommendations every February 15th. You report that. So this is in that transition phase between a draft document and then a final document. But that occurs by February 15th. We just came off of that, so there's a number of people that were involved in updating their drug amount reporting records to the FDA. Now, we're soon approaching May, and sometimes it gets a little busy. If you have that responsibility, here's just a quick notice. Go ahead and call RETEC, and we'll be able to help you out with that particular reporting. So let's move over to the implementations. In the remaining time, I'm going to run through these implementations very quickly. I pulled a couple of them out. There's just a few comments I'd like to make on each one, and then there are some reports that we'll take a very quick look at as well. Before we get into that, Aaron, why don't we run a really quick poll that you had organized and set up at this point?
Absolutely. Here we go. Okay, so in addition to your standard establishment registration and listing SPLs, what SPL file types are you required to submit? And for this question, please select all that apply. So we have GDUFA, LDR, as Gary just mentioned, the DAR, DDR kind of nameless report associated with the CARES Act. We have REMS, and then of course we have the Health Canada XML product monograph.
All right, you getting some results in there?
Yep, absolutely. We'll leave it open just for a couple more seconds. And I did just want to note, Gary, I know we've been referring to the CARES Act report as the DAR today. And that's the closest to, I think, the name that the FDA has given us for now. But I did just drop DDR in that because RETEC had previously been referring to this report as DDR, or Drug Distribution Report. And I didn't want to create any confusion. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Gary, I'm showing the results here. What do you think?
I unfortunately can't see them from my.
Oh no! Sorry, I thought you could. Well, let me.
I'll be glad to look at them later.
Yes,
but
yes.
Anything noteworthy?
Well, we just might want to move on, obviously, for time, but just really quickly, we have about 25% for GDUFA, 53% for LDR, 39% for the DAR, 33% for REMS, which is kind of surprising, and 19% for Health Canada.
Very good, very good. Okay, so thank you very much for poll number 2. I know there's one more in the list here, and looking at the material and our time, maybe we didn't cut enough out, but I think what that means is I'll hit the highlights and leave some of these slides, the details of the slides, for your homework, you'll certainly be able to download all this information and take a look at it later. So we're going to work our way through these documents, as I mentioned. We did the poll. So let's do a quick flyover on the labeler code request. To understand that, just a really quick tutorial on National Drug Code. If you're in this industry, like you're aware of this like the back of your hand. If you're new, it's one of the basic things you need to learn. So this is a number that's assigned to a particular drug product. Includes 3 segments: a labor code segment, a product code segment, and the packaging code segment. Grand total 10 digits. Those 3 segments are separated by 2 hyphens, and there can be a couple different variations. So early on, the FDA used 4 digits, followed by 4 digits, followed by 2 digits. And then more recently, they switched to 5 digits for the labor code. So you had a 532 and then a 541. And guess what? They're running out of numbers in the 5 digit. It's expected a couple years, they might have to use 6 digits there. In my opinion, it'll probably eventually go over to a 642. Not in place yet, but just realize that a couple years down the road, there'll be another variation of this identifier. But what I want to highlight is connected to the labeler code. That is assigned by the FDA. So for you to generate the other 2 segments, the product code and the package code, which the labeler owns and manages on their own, you'll have to have the very first segment. So that is what the labeler code request is all about. So if you have a need to list a drug and create a NDC number, obviously, you'll have to send a request in. It's SPL is the vehicle to put that request in. You put some numbers in there or data in there, the DUNS number, company name, contact, and so on. And then the FDA will email you your labeler code. You resubmit that SPL labeler code document, now with the labeler code as part of that in the second revision. And then for the most part, you're done unless there's a change. So that's a nice thing. This is probably a one-time with a little bit of maintenance. Many times there could be, a contact change, or maybe there's a zip code change or something like that. But for the most part, it's pretty static. That information is put into a National Drug Code directory. We won't go into all those details. This is one of those pages I'll leave for homework. But it is exposed to the public, by the way. You can look up your labor codes, and as well as everyone else. The next one is I'm going to touch on establishment registration. So with very little exceptions, if you engaged in manufacturing, repacking, relabeling, or salvaging a drug product, you'll need to register your establishment. So the data there, again, is very similar: the DUNS number, company name, contact information, and so on. And then every year you need to respond. So either you send an update to that information, again, it might be your contact or phone number change, or you submit an SPL no change document. But that has to be done in the 4th quarter. And again, this information is exposed to the public in DECRS, a shortcut for the Drug Establishment Current Registration Site. We're going to move over to the next document, the Generic Drug Facility Self-ID. Now, this is just focused in on those manufacturers that are connected with manufacturing APIs or final dosage forms, or it might be both. And if you do that particular activity, you will need to pay a generic drug facility fee. Rather expensive, but it does require you to have that in place going forward. There's others that need to also self-ID, but they don't have to pay the fee. Those packagers, labels, repackers, and testers. Information about the company. Now, if you're a generic drug facility, be aware that this does not replace that establishment registration that we just talked about previously. You will need to submit both documents, the establishment registration and the the generic drug facility self-identification. This particular requirement has to come in during the month of May every year, and there is information made publicly. So let's move over to labeling. This is probably the core use of SPL, along with the OTC. So those products that have an NDA or ANDA or BLA connected to them, those new applications, you'll need to report the content of labeling as part of the ECTD submission. And typically the changes with the FDA are negotiated in Word, and then a final is put together, and then you'll need to submit that final. And then there's instructions to submit that as well to the Office of the Commissioner as a listed. So let's talk about that. A drug listing. So those products that went through the application process need to list their products as well. Many times the listing is by convention is referred to as those products that are over the counter. So now we have final orders, may have been using product monographs term. It refers to those products that are able to be using pretty much an FDA either final or unapproved order, and put those products on the market without going through an application. So all of those products, as well as the biologic and animals, and we can look at that list earlier. And the content for this SPL listing is very much dependent on the actual drug type. So the over-the-counter version is relatively short. It's really the drug facts, the text of that, principal display package image, and the metadata that is packaged together for the SPL. These particular SPLs are sent to the Office of the Commissioner. The FDA makes them available, and then a copy sent over to the National Library of Medicine. So here's just a real quick image of the principal display package for Dayquil. And you see the drug facts. This content is also put into tagged information, so it's now become searchable. So we talk about all the advantages of putting that into an XML tag structure, so you can search for the drug facts. Here's the image, and then again, this is a homework slide, obviously, but this is the metadata that would be connected. So there's a lot of different fields. Those are the codes, that controlled terminologies that we talked about. Aaron, let's roll in this third and last poll question at this point.
Absolutely, Gary. So we're going to launch this right now. What type of drugs does your company list? Again, please select all that apply. So we have human RX, human over-the-counter, biologics, animal health, and cosmetics. Obviously, there might be some overlap in these as well, but just select all that apply. So we'll leave this open for about another 20 seconds, give everybody a couple seconds to answer, but then give Gary the rest of his time. I don't want to take too much up. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And it looks like we have 70% with human RX, 26% human over-the-counter, 53% with biologics, 5% with animal health, and 16% with cosmetics. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Gary.
All right, great, very interesting. We have just a couple here that I want to knock out that we want to touch on. And again, looking forward to future conversations where we can spend more time digging into some of the details. But this is near the end of the year requirement. Again, that last quarter always is a little bit of concern, and always seems to compete with Thanksgiving and Christmas. But this blanket no changes certification, really, this is a certification that the drug product has been reviewed, it's deemed accurate, and it's up to date, and there's been no change since the previous year. Now, if you actually do make a change during the course of the year, you don't have to include it in this list. So an update submission will supplant actually including it here. But if there's no other activity, go ahead and put it in there, and you have that fourth quarter time frame. What's in scope? Pretty much everything that you see on Daily Med. So everything that has a active drug listing would need to be included. How does this work? So the establishment registration is responsible to do this. So if you're involved in any of these activities, there's a little bit of discussion on that third bullet about contract manufacturer organizations. They're technically responsible, and then many times private label distributors actually do a submission on behalf of the CMO. And that's okay, but make sure you don't end up having two submissions. Don't overstep, or make sure one of you actually does it, and then some other agents. So the reported data is really just this list of the NDC product codes. All right, REMS. So REMS is a risk evaluation mitigation strategy, and it would be required by the FDA for certain medications that have great advantage and great benefits, but yet there are some concerns about the risk connected with that. So they do put a plan in place for these particular products. There's not many of these, roughly about 60 or so, that are selected from all the what we have there, 140,000 on Daily Med. But this information, any updates or a new submission now has to be packaged inside REMS SPL. So previously it was submitted by PDF. There's some REM documents and materials that go with it. There's a dedicated website, so what you submit is actually made public. And the timeline, I think I referred to this earlier, we had this 2-year window where the final guidance came out, and this is an example where a electronic submission was defined, and this is now a requirement as of December 28, 2022, so just a couple months ago. Anything going forward with a new or modified REMS would have to use SPL. All right, moving over to the biologics lot distribution. Again, it's only for those biological products. You need to report the production information, so the lots, the fills, distribution counts, and this is typically every 6 months. This particular one, it caught a lot of attention because February just passed. So it's listed drug and biologic product amount reporting. I'm going back and forth on trying to come up with a good name for this acronym. But basically, those products that are listed now need to report their production activity, and whether it's internally or whether it's been exported. So there's a lot of information about that. Noteworthy though is this is a comma separated value file, and it's reported to the FDA Next Gen, which is a little bit different than everything that we've been talking about so far. I'll leave this for homework. Again, what's in scope and what's out of scope. Rule of thumb here is everything that you list is in scope. There's a very few exceptions. I would be remiss if we don't close out and talk a little bit about Health Canada and Europe EMA, the European Medicines Association. So both Health Canada and the EMA obviously have labeling, longstanding labeling, and are making changes to the means and the content that they collect and how they collect it. So if we talk about both of these, I'm going to use this one slide to refer to both. The Health Canada has elected to use SPL and the very same HL7 SPL standard that the FDA uses. So we talked earlier about all these different documents that are able to be defined on guidance. Well, guess what? Health Canada pretty much mimicked that. They did not copy it, but they used it as a precedent, and they created their own style sheet, their own business rules, their implementation guides, and now they have a pilot voluntary submission in XML product monograph expected later this year to be required. Well, cross your fingers. Now, when you go to Europe, though, the EMA is looking at this other health standard that I alluded to earlier, this fast healthcare interoperability resources standard. It's from health level 7 also, but it's quote a much more modern or standard that is looking forward. So this FHIR standard has been selected by the EMA to capture their product metadata. So we'll see how that goes. Well, it's already rolling out. There's a lot of discussion in another meeting that we can talk about the EMA. I think I'm going to stop there. I see the hour has come about, and Aaron, I'm going to turn this back to you. Are you going to try to fit in a couple hot questions? I know we're pretty much on the hour.
You know, Gary, all of the questions that came in were actually very specific. So I think that we'll just have, you know, our experts follow up with everyone via email. So you definitely can expect answers to your questions. But just to sort of reinforce what Gary was just saying, a lot of this that we had to skip over or leave for homework, we definitely will be addressing in future webinars. So we're currently, you know, coming up with the topics that we think are going to be the best to cover. So if there's anything you'd like to see, certainly you can reach out to us at pharma@readtech.com, and we'd be happy to, you know, take those topics into consideration. Additionally, I did just want to mention, you know, ReadTech is always trying to provide the ultimate level of expertise and optimally streamlined processes for our SPL customers. So as a result, we are now offering ECTD services through our strategic alliances. We're really excited about this. So I encourage you to reach out to your account manager, or again, pharma@readtech.com to learn more. And yeah, you can definitely stay tuned throughout the year. You'll be receiving information about some more Upskill with ReadTech webinars, and we hope to see you there. And thanks for your participation today. And of course, thank you, Gary, for your time and expertise on this.
Yep, thanks, Aaron, for facilitating. Great job. Thank you for those in the audience to setting aside the time. Greatly appreciate your input and connectivity. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.